So now we're in chapter 8 and we're kind of putting all those skills together in a basic listening sequence. And so when we think about the skills, again, we think about open questions, which do not require a yes or no answer, begin the session. And then we use them throughout the session. Closed-ended questions we use very rarely, but we would use them to get demographic information or when trying to get clarification. Encouragers are going to give us details throughout the session. Paraphrases give us the essence of what the client's saying. Reflection of feeling, of course, is giving us the emotion. And that summary we're going to use throughout the session to finish up the interview at the end also and to review what the client has said. We could also use a summary statement to start a new session. That, remember, last week we talked about your challenges with your mom, your challenges with your children, and how you were coping with this virus. How's that been going? So lots of different ways we could use a summary statement. We always want to use our really good nonverbal skills and our observation throughout the entire counseling process. Next slide. So when we think about our counseling session, we want to think about first and always the relationship. So if we don't have relationship or rapport, it doesn't really matter what else happens, because a client's not going to open up to someone that they don't feel comfortable with. And so we want to really work at that rapport with the client. And that might look like a lot of different things. For me, for some clients, if I'm seeing a child, I dress even differently than if I'm seeing an adult. So trying to think about matching the client so you're not overly formal if the client's more casual, or you're not very casual if you're seeing a formal client. I want to think about, could I connect with the client in some way right at the beginning to develop rapport? Maybe I noticed that they have on a certain team's football jersey, and so we can talk about that. Or I had a client that every week we talked about that she loved cold weather and I hated cold weather, and we had that conversation week after week after week as our way of connection. With kids, you might learn what do they like to do, what are their favorite hobbies, and talk with them about that. So when we begin the session, again, we're going to use those open-ended questions. So how's it been going since I saw you last? What's been going on? Closed questions, again, for diagnosis and clarification. Paraphrasing is going to give us the content of the client's story. Reflection of feeling, usually it's going to be brief in the early stages. It's going to help us hone in on that key emotion. Summary will complete our interview. And again, we're going to encourage throughout to get details from the client. So when we think about all of those skills, one emphasis that you might remember from Carl Rogers is empathy, that the client really wants to know, does my therapist care about me? Do they want to help me? Are they for me? And so that's so important as you think about your skills as a clinician, to be very, very sure that the client knows you care, that they know that you're cheering for them and that you want to help them. So when we think about how to develop empathy, we want to try to see, feel, and hear the client's world, to try to experience that as best we can without mixing in our own thoughts and feelings. So the better vocabulary we have with feeling words, the more effective we're going to be in doing that. Next slide. So there are 5 stages that are going to form our counseling session. And I have an acronym that is a little different than the book to help you remember. And so I'll do both. So in the book, it's called Relationship. In my acronym, it's R, Relate to the Client. So that's that rapport building. If I don't have a relationship, it doesn't matter what else happens. The second stage is Story and Strengths, according to narrative therapy, or for us, E, Explore the problem. So I want to hear the client's story. I want to explore what has brought them here. What's the real issue? I always know that I, as the clinician, am not the owner of their story. The client is. The client is always, always the expert on their own story. So even in my intake form, if there's a lot of detail and it tells me a lot of things going on with the client, I still want to ask and let them tell me in their own words what's going on. Goals or ACT. I want the client to identify active goals. What do they want to happen? These are not my goals, and that's really hard for beginning therapists to not push goals onto a client. These are the client's goals. And so I'm going to ask the client, so as I've heard you talk about the challenges that you're having at home, at work, at school, what of all those things would you like to work on most? Or how could I be most helpful to you? And so I want to develop goals. And if you look at that SMART, S-M-A-R-T acronym, I want those to be SMART goals. Next slide. And then ReStory, or in our acronym CHOOSE, is helping the client generate choices or a plan to meet those goals. So if a client's goal is to reduce their depression, then I'm going to generate some choices to help them. And so in reducing their depression, we could increase their access to a support system. We could increase their mindfulness skills. And then the action, this is where, or H, help, we're going to help them to practice those behaviors. So that's when our homework comes in. And so if my client is depressed and their goal is to reduce their depressive symptoms, and one of the action plans that I have, or the choices that I have, is to help them to expand their support network, then a plan I might have, or a homework assignment I might have, could be, I'd like you to touch base with 3 people who could be potential support for you during this time, and have a 15-minute conversation with at least one of them. Okay? And so we're practicing that behavior. Another thing that we could do in homework is have the client journal, or have the client calendar. So you say that one of the challenges that you have is that you feel pressed for time. So this week I'd like you to make a list every day of what do you do from the time you wake up until the time you go to bed. And then let's look next week and see how that aligns with your goals and your priorities. So again, there's that 5-stage process of our interview, which is an interchangeable term for our session. So relationship, initiating the session, building rapport. Story and strength, that's when we're gathering data and drawing out stories or issues or challenges. Goals, we're setting mutual goals. What does the client want to happen? ReStory is when we're working, exploring alternatives. So what if the client comes up with a goal that you think is not a good goal? So you can say, that's one idea. Not necessarily a good idea, but that's one idea. What else do you have in mind? As we work through alternatives, we want to continue to help the client narrow their focus so that they can meet their goals in a really good way. Action is we use for terminating and for helping them come up with new stories, and for helping them succeed in doing what they came to do in the therapeutic work. So as we think about the idea of terminating and generalizing, that stage 5, we think about homework, role play. I could use imagery like the empty chair technique. I could have them chart, like we talked about, their calendar, or sometimes just keeping a record of how many times a week am I frustrated with my child, or what are the times when I get really frustrated with my husband. And so in keeping a record of that, then we can identify patterns and help the client to change their behavior surrounding those patterns. I always want to follow up and be supportive of the client and the decisions that they make. It's hard to change your life, but clients can do it with your help and support.